busy person, but your views on philosophy and mediation were essential. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikram. I'm really happy to be here, and I really want to send my compliments and express my compliments for this initiative. It's very important. You bring the world together in sharing ideas, views, and in this dialogue on mediation, which is really important. I think actually that in the world we need some more attitude to mediation everywhere, and I think we can feel it already in our daily life. And of course, being European and knowing what happens at the eastern borders of Europe, the idea of talking about the possibility of mediating between opposites is quite up to date and quite urgent, I would say. So I'm really happy to be here, and happy because you're promoting something that is worth the while, really. So thank you.
And it's a topic which is, of course, close to your heart. And that discussion that we had on Socrates and mediation, it was wonderful. And of course, it's lying on the YouTube channel. So if someone wants to go to Mediator Vikram channel and search for Federico. I think Federico, if you search Federico, you'll find that, or Socrates and mediation, you'll find that. So Federico, give me 1 second. What I'll do is, let me just put up the little introduction to where people can find information. And then we just go into the topic, and then it's your show. And I am a spectator, maybe not a mute one, like I say, but maybe a spectator. So mediatorvikram.com, that's what you find that. So this is what we have now, the number of people we've got. So it's been, I'm still thinking, Federico, it's still small, the group. It could have been bigger, but I think people really felt that what are they going to talk about? And then when you start talking about it, you find out there's so much there is that you can talk about in relation to mediation philosophy. So all the social media links, and of course, support, mediation circle, World Mediation Circle, which of course we'll maybe talk about it if you have time later, and shows and events, all the links are there. And various events have happened. So Federico has been in Heart, Soul, Spirituality and Mediation also. And of course, that forum series. So there's lots happening here. So Federico, I don't think I should take more time of that. But what I did put down was in the World Mediation Circle, of course, a bit on why these circles and how I'm trying to do it. But important thing was I've asked people to become patrons, and that link is here. Please become a patron, support the dispute resolution revolution. So that's how it is. Federico, your show, please take it ahead, and I'll come in if you want me to come in.
Okay, thank you, Vikram. Well, considering that I have already talked about the contribution of classical and old philosophy to mediation, this time I would like to put my attention on a more modern and contemporary idea.
But Federico, you have to tell us about yourself, because that will help us connect to where you're coming from. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I'm philosopher of law at the University of Padua, where I'm a researcher, a senior researcher, and I teach philosophy of law. And now in this semester, I'm also teaching an interesting class that it's about teaching law, how to learn to teach law. And I try to do it in a way that doesn't only think of law as an object, but more as a relationship. And so I brought a little bit of my mediation attitude into this course. I am also a mediator. I am a lawyer, but I no longer exercise as a lawyer. I still do mediation when my university authorizes me. It sometimes happens when the tribunal directly asks for a mediation. We have this kind of mediation sent directly by the judge, and so I'm involved in mediation processes. And I am currently the scientific director of a winter school called Transforming 21st Century Conflicts, which will luckily have its second edition worldwide online late in February. I am also involved in the European Forum for Restorative Justice, where I should basically chair the scientific committee starting from next year. So I'm really involved in many different things related to either the penal sector and civil sector. As being a legal philosopher and dealing a lot with legal methodology, I can switch from one sector to another of law, because legal philosophy is in a way trans sector. What gave me the idea for today's speech is actually another project I'm involved in that is called Uni for Justice. That is basically a project that involves many different universities, like mine, the University of Padova, and we celebrate 800 years this year, so happy birthday to my university. Which is one of the oldest around, I guess. 800 years is a big thing, you know. But basically, we are involved in trying to cooperate with tribunals, with local tribunals, and to assist them and their newly hired cooperators for the efficacy and efficiency of legal practices within the tribunals. And my part, the part of my group I'm coordinating to young researchers, is to work on two different things which are some way related. One is to implement restorative practices in the penal sector. And the other one is to work on empowering the referral from judges to mediation. So the diversion from the legal process to mediation practices. Why does it happen? Because it's been encouraged by a recent reform in the Italian legal system, a justice reform, that involved both mediation in civil matters and restorative justice in penal matters, with the idea that a more relational approach to solving disputes, it's not just about fostering efficacy and efficiency of the whole justice system, but is also useful and helpful to prevent interpersonal conflict and to solve it in a way that is more constructive for a society. So basically, in Italy, we have this reform that, you know, is providing us with a wider and probably more interesting legal framework. But as I happened to say at a conference we had in Padua just a couple of weeks ago, legal frameworks are just words, and a law doesn't make things happen. There is just norms, but to make things happen, you need to acquire a certain perspective, mentality, and to understand what are the goals and the means that you use. Because, you know, it is frequent in Europe and in Italy that people talk about, and I'm focusing more on mediation, as some sort of, you know, alternative to something else. That is interesting, that is useful, that is nice, because it's alternative to something that doesn't work, the legal process, or that it's too long, or that costs too much, or whatever. But this way, you look towards mediation because it has this fashionable alternative world calling for you. But there is a very big risk on this. You look for mediation because of its being alternative, and you don't understand what the core concept of mediation is. So it's just, you know, I want to be a refugee in another world because I don't like the world of legal trials, and I'm no longer satisfied by it, you know. And on the other hand, as well, you think that mediation will solve everything of a legal system, which is not possible at all. Because I will say, as a mediator and as a legal philosopher, you cannot think that mediation will solve any kind of dispute. You don't do a favor to mediation for that. You know, so I tend to say to my colleagues, also lawyer colleagues, this A of alternative dispute resolution is not correct. You should say appropriate dispute resolution. With this A, that means that you need to understand, to analyze each situation, understand which approach is the most, how can I say, convincing one according to the parties, to the situation, to the framework that you have, and whatever. So you need some assessment of the situation. But in order to do so, you need to know which kind of instruments you have in your own toolkit as a lawyer, as a mediator, whatever, you know. And this is actually my starting point. I've been doing mediation for, say, 12 years at least as a civil mediator, and I've been theorizing mediation both in methodology and legal philosophy for more than 10 years, you know. And one of the typical arguments that I find when I talk about this with colleagues, either at the university or lawyers, whatever, is first, well, I understand that it might be useful, but I already do it. I do lots of compromises, agreements, settlements. Why do I need mediation? This is one argument. So putting immediately mediation in the very same conceptual box of those transactions, compromises that normally lawyers do. But exactly, you don't understand that it's a process, and you don't understand why there is a third party, and you probably don't understand that the kind of dialogue that you can set in a mediation is different than just trying to meet somebody halfway for a simple agreement. You know, it is something different. And the other argument that is quite, you know, typical is, yes, once again, it is useful just because I want to stay away from the legal process. So I fear something, then the alternative comes to be useful. But this is not the right question, you know, because of course it is important to think in terms of utility. But if I have to put it in philosophical terms, why does mediation, why is mediation there? Why do I need mediation? Are there other ethical or whatever kind of arguments that sustain the presence and the importance of mediation that are not just being useful for something? And a third level of objection is, well, to make people talk and understand each other, you don't need the law, and you don't need lawyers, and you don't need the fact that mediators can have or should have, it depends, also a legal background. This is a more psychological, sociological, communicative things. So considering that I'm a philosopher, but a philosopher of law, my problem is, how do I relate the idea and the ideal, maybe also of mediation, to law? Considering my background, I'm Italian, I'm European, and my background is not common law, you know, although, you know, European law is evolving in a sense, common law and civil law are getting closer one to the other, thanks also to the European integration. But, you know, and this is the question. So it is never easy when you try to put it in more philosophical terms, when you start saying, for instance, mediation involves a relational approach that puts at the center people and relationships, that promotes mutual understanding in the search for agreed upon solutions that are not necessarily a compromise, that could be really a solution, or even in case a transformation of the conflict according to the different approaches that you might, you know, adopt, be it humanistic, transformative, narrative, whatever. I use different kinds of mediation because, you know, it depends also on the kinds of situations that I have in front of me. It is not that easy to use a humanistic mediation if you have an insurance company in front of you. But I use techniques that I use in restorative justice in case of medical malpractices, because then you have somebody which has been harmed. And so you can talk about harms, needs, suffering, the way you do maybe also in the penal mediation. So, you know, so when I'm saying agreed upon solutions through a dialogical process, I tend to use a very wide umbrella that embodies different approaches and methodologies. And you know that I already told you in other occasions that I have this Socratic attitude to mediation. So dialogue is very much, and argumentation are very much at the center of my approach to mediation. But this doesn't mean that this is just a dogmatic approach to mediation. So you can do mediation only that way. To me, it is important that a mediator has a very eclectic and open, wide approach, knowing different methodologies and approaches so that you can adapt yourself to your own identity and to the situation. So this adaptivity, which means also being context sensitive. And so under this premise, relational approach, people at the center, dialogue, understanding, searching for solutions in a way that is context sensitive. These are keywords that especially in my own environment, are not easy to relate to the concept, but also to the practice of law. And also to make them match with the mentality of many lawyers and many judges. The typical objections that we get from judges in this project I told you is, well, if I have to study this cause, this situation, why do I need mediation? I can already decide it. And it's not easy to say, well, you can study it and understand that maybe sending these parties to mediation is not just, gaining time, energies, resources, but is also helping them to solve their situation, and not through your decision, that as in the Latin word decidere means to cut, to cut away, but also to find something that unites them rather than divides them, and this is hard with judges to make them understand, because you have to put them within another world that they understand as alternative, but they don't often understand what happens at the mediation table. And when you have to describe it, the kind of typical reaction is, but this is psychological. This is not dealing with the law. And as a philosopher of law, of course, I have my hard time to explain, yeah, it depends on the idea of law that you have, of course. But also with lawyers or with other scholars, civil procedure, whatever, if you only look at the legal framework of mediation, you only have a couple of norms. But this is nothing dealing with the heart of the mediation process. I may understand how the procedure works, how you relate it to the terms of the legal trial that maybe is already ongoing, whatever. You can understand the meaning of the agreement in terms of being executive, whatever. But then, does that explain what mediation really is? Not really. And so why is it hard to make, let's say, in a sense, also the revolution of mediation match with the idea of law and the practice of law in the Western world, in my European, Italian world, whatever? And consider that the reform on civil mediation was already in there in 2010, and there has been an evolution in terms of lawyers and people getting involved in the field of mediation and adopting this worldview, in a sense, as being part of the identity of legal professionals. But still, it is not that easy to enter within a certain mentality and perspective. And we have to understand, in my opinion, that it is hard because our idea and our practice of law is directly coming from what happened during the whole modern era, which is, at least 500 years in the Western world. And in the modern world, certain ideas and maybe even ideologies on law have provided us with a mentality that doesn't match very well with mediation. And to explain so, I would need a whole course of philosophy of law. So without inviting you all in Padua, let me just try to be very simple. And I will use an argument that I already explored as being effective at a recent TED talk that I had in Treviso last October. So quite a recent thing. I would ask you to pick up from your imagination and think about how justice is usually represented in the arts, for instance, or in the symbology. Well, probably you will say that justice is a lady or a goddess, according, and that's because it's a virtue, of course, and so a feminine, quality in a sense. And then what are the other symbols related to justice? Well, there are three, but I would like to show you that these three symbols are ambiguous, and they didn't come all together at the same time during the process of the modern evolution of law in the Western world, which is important. Of course, the first symbol, which is already there since the Greeks and the Romans, so it's the most ancient symbol related to justice, is the scale. justice promotes balances and is activated when an imbalance happens, unbalances. So you need to rebalance things. And of course, justice has to do with measures, has to do with, how can I say, equity and equality at the same time, which are not the same things, of course. But this idea of balancing situations, whose underlying premise is that between and among individuals, there must be some reciprocity. And I will go back to this. Then there is another symbol, which is interesting because it comes to be, if you look at the representation, at the depictions of justice, I mean, in Italy, we are so lucky that we have art from the Romans to today, you know. So also in our cities, if I go around Padua and look at the Cappella degli Scrovegni depicted by Giotto, justice has the scale. Or if I go to the palace in downtown, the town hall, again, the scale. But then more modern representations, say between the 15th, 16th century, have also the sword. And what is the meaning of the sword? Big question. Well, of course, already the Romans used to say, law is there. I'll say it in Latin and then translate it, ne cives ad arma ruant, in order to prevent citizens to do justice on themselves, to recur to weapons, you know. So this weapon, this sword, is there in the hand of justice to say, you don't do justice on your own. And justice is there to prevent people, and law as well, from doing justice on their own. So it's to prevent the circles of vengeance or revenges or vindications, whatever you call them, and to help transforming conflict into something else, a process that helps people not to directly use violence to recreate a situation of balance, whatever, if there is a balance. You don't necessarily use your own force to do an eye for an eye and whatever, you know. Yes, this is, of course, one possible meaning, and probably a very likely meaning. But when you relate the emergency of the symbol of the sword to modern times, so to the fact that in Europe we were witnessing the downfall of the empires and of the church as well, and the formation of national states or small, you know, entities, well, then the sword means within the sovereign state, we, the state, have the monopoly of law. We have the monopoly of the exercise of justice. And this is exactly the time in which, as I said, Europe was, you know, facing a moment of very big transformation at the end of medieval times. And in medieval times, you had a very peculiar moment in which the state was not that strong, you know, especially, you know, law was there as a discipline. Law was studied, was practiced, but basically the common law, jus commune, was there as a practice, but also as a conceptual creation that happened at the very beginning between experts of law and then between universities. But you didn't have this idea of the state as a creator of an order. This wasn't medieval at all. But when the state steps in, and it steps in because you have the crisis of the two unifying factors of the whole medieval mentality, which are the church on one hand, and on the other, the empire, then you need to refound once again the origin of law and, how can I say, provide law, the order and the power with a new justification, which is no longer the idea of a cosmic order that is granted in a sense by a cosmic order. And also the emperor, I mean, was in a sense when Charles wanted the Pope to put a crown on his head, was sometimes in a sense also saying, it's not just a legitimation from the church. So, well, I am there because the church provides me with divine powers, it's not the only possible meaning. It is also saying, I am the grantor of an order, but I will respond to the big grantor with the big G, you know, so to God, to this idea. And of course, Dante Alighieri, for instance, in his book De Monarchia, had this idea that the emperor would be, interesting, a mediator between local identities with not necessarily a territory, so not the idea of the Roman Empire or whatever, but a mediator between the different forces and different local, federal, in a sense, entities that would need to relate and have somebody unifying them. The emperor, the jus commune, so this creation that was there when enacted, when other forms of regulations were not available or were conflicting one with the other, you know. And of course, there was a common religious and philosophical background. But of course, the whole thing went together, you know, the reform divided the church, and there were many other divisions. And this was also a very important occasion for the states of Northern Europe to set free from the emperor, of course, you know, and of course you could not longer relate to religion or to the emperor to unify within a common idea of legal order. So you had Huig van der Grotius saying, well, you have to grant my rights. I'll say it in Latin, etiam si daremus non esse Deum. Even if we admitted that God doesn't exist or he doesn't care about human things. And this is the big season of nature law. And this is the new narrative that comes in exactly at the beginning of modernity. Also at the change of mentality. Modernity witnesses at the early beginning of the 16th century, a very anthropocentric, human-centric, you know, revolution. You see also in the depiction of Leonardo da Vinci, the Vitruvian Man, so the human being at the center of the university. But this is also matched by a highly individualistic, rationalistic approach, a very high, how can I say, trust on the human capabilities of understanding things and projecting things. So what is typical of this moment is that human beings understand themselves as homo faber, as creators of their own order. I'm quoting Hannah Arendt now, you know. So I am creating my own order because I have the capability to do so, and my reason is able to provide me with this. So you no longer relate directly a cosmic order to a divine situation, but is more human-centered. But on the other hand, you have a very divided situation politically. It's a moment of continuous wars between and among states, you know, and you need to refound, to find another narrative to understand why these entities, especially nation-centered entities, are there as the new grantors of the order. So states like Spain, France, England, you know, whatever, they were united and they wanted to be on their own. They didn't need to relate to an emperor or to another entity providing one with legitimacy. So in the big season of nature law, the narrative was something like this, you know, and of course I am really shrinking concepts that should require a lot of time. But when I'm quoting the School of Nature Law, of course, I'm thinking of authors like I already quoted Grotius, but Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and these Samuel von Pufendorf are these authors that commonly are, you know, using three concepts: the idea of nature law and a state of nature, which is exactly a pre-state situation in which human beings, hypothetically or historically, it depends on the different, you know, approaches, are without the state, a previous situation. Then you have the social contract, which is exactly the kind of legal, philosophical, political figure that is used to move from this state of nature to the civil state, I mean, to the real state. And here, law as state law begins. Of course, there are different approaches, because if I quoted Thomas Hobbes, and from Thomas Hobbes, we have a justification of absolutism. if you look at John Locke, you have a liberal approach to monarchy, or even an influential approach that was really very strong in the whole process of the American Constitution, because John Locke is really influencing the American fathers in a liberal way, in a liberal approach to the state, to law and whatever. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course, has influenced a lot the debate on democracy, but also with some elements that influenced also totalitarian ideas of order. So, you know, from this you have really different developments, but in a sense, the Western world has experienced all these forms of legal and political order. What is common is that basically these authors describe the state of nature and the situation of nature's law as a state in which human beings are basically driven by what is their own nature, and of course according to them. So being highly rational, individualistic, utilitarian usually, and in a state of conflict, with the idea that they cannot solve their conflict on their own. So Hobbes says that, for instance, it is bellum omnium contra omnes, a war of everybody against everybody else. In John Locke, the situation is slightly different, but you don't know how to defend yourself in case of attack. And how can another citizen equal to others, another human being, claim to have the right to judge another situation? So you need a third party to do so. And of course, in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it's even different because the situation is basically in this state, you slightly enter a spiral in which you either are dominated or dominator, but surely are not happy at all, you know. And so what do you need to do? Conflict is not only unavoidable, but cannot be solved on your own. You need to create an artificial way to get away from that situation. So the state, the legal order, and this is the point, and law, in a sense, you know, and the political order are an artificial creation. So which is a totally different world from the Aristotelian view, zoon politikon, I said it in Greek, you know. So we are political because we are relational, which was basically an idea of the ancient world. And so the, how can I say, law and the social situation was embedded with human nature. Here you have the opposite. You need to create an artificial order because human nature brings to a deadly or unsustainable situation. So the law and the order are artificial creations, but our creations. We do it. We are the grantors of our happiness, of our projects, or whatever. And this is really modern. The modern idea of human beings is we are in charge of our destiny. Of course, there is lots of trust on the human capability of promoting things, of creating, of doing projects. And this is typically modern, you know. And so the state is an artificial creation. How to do that? By an agreement. The social contract. Everybody agrees upon the fact that we need to move to another direction, which is creating the state. And this is funny. You know that one of my most important philosophical references is an author of those times, Giambattista Vico, who was a sustainer of nature law, but completely under a different perspective. I used to say that Vico was the critical conscience of modern times. And in my most recent book, I called, it's in Italian, of course, Giambattista Vico's philosophy, a discarded paradigm. Because what he suggested was a totally different approach, but this wasn't the winner. At the time, he wrote, I mean, his legal works in the early 1700s, you know, and at the time, Europe had already taken another direction. So what is the social contract? And this is funny. We agree upon the fact that after the social contract, somebody else will take care of creating laws and solving conflicts. And Vico says, for instance, to Thomas Hobbes, you describe human beings as wolves, as predators, one against the other. You describe the fact that you need to do so because otherwise there is a war. And why do you consider them able to talk and perform a social contract if they were not able to do so? Aren't you implicitly admitting that meeting an agreement is already there, is possible, and is in the human dimension? And this is quite hard objection that we find already a century or later on by Hegel. So the Hegelian approach was also critical to this idea of nature law, you know. And this is interesting because after the state has been created, according to the different views, you enter in a world that is mostly heteronomous. So it is relying on a third party, on a superior power to provide the legal order with regulation and with decisions. So you no longer believe in the possibilities that human beings solve things on their own. You do it only once with a social contract, and then you leave it to the state. And so the third that turns to be right now the very symbol of justice has another meaning. And it is the state has the monopoly of exercising power and creating the legal order. And things get more complicated now because already in this time, the third symbol was no longer there, was not yet there, sorry. And it is the blindfold. In ancient times and also in medieval times, the blindfold was related to luck, to fortune, because fortune was blind. Justice had to look to the eyes of the situations very well and understand them. So why the blindfold? And this is, to me, there is much of Jean-Jacques Rousseau behind the idea of the blindfold. Because if you follow my reasoning, basically the social contract is a contract between individuals creating a state, and then the relationships that are created by the state, be it regulation or solving conflicts, place conflict always between the individual and the legal order, the individual and the state. So basically individuals are all equal because they have no differences. But this is not the only way to think of equality, as removing differences, which is something that is quite fashionable in Western culture nowadays. You're equal because there are no differences. Well, having equal dignity doesn't mean that I'm exactly the same as you are. But the blindfold, that is usually explained also in legal schools as being impartial, has a very dark side. That means being impersonal. And this is what entered slowly within the idea and the practice of law in modern times. So the idea that you don't see people, you don't see their stories, you don't see their relationships. The order is an abstract idea of legal order. And even after the big season of nature law, you don't need anymore even nature's law. When Napoleon created the civil code, any referral to nature law was taken away. In case of doubt, all you need is the law. Every answer is within the law. And in front of the law, you're all equal. Maybe. And so, after this season, you enter the world of legal positivism that says, basically, law is made by rules. Only by rules. So if you look at the, for instance, Hans Kelsen, so the most important exponent of legal positivism, there is no trace in his very interesting and articulated creation of thinking about law as a world in which relationships are there. There are only rules, and rules provided of efficacy by the state. And so you understand why I'm really running fast. At the end of the 20th century, there was this kind of I wouldn't say, you know, feeling not comfortable with this idea, and the idea that basically between the theory and practice of law and how people experience and live their own conflict, there is a distance that is getting wider and wider. And this is exactly where, for instance, mediation, restorative justice, and these ideas came up saying, listen, we are missing something. We are missing the idea that it's not all about rules. It's not about an abstract idea of order. People have their lives. People experience conflict. People experience breaks into their relationships. And maybe they have also the resources for dealing with these conflicts on their own. So big question, are we unraveling the social contract and saying, take it? We made a mistake. The state was a big mistake, a big, how can I say, myth invented by the modern thinking. It doesn't work, sorry. And of course it doesn't work now. I mean, we have lots of problems also in political terms. Are states able to deal with the new economy on their own? Are they able to provide themselves with energy supplies and whatever? They don't. And also the idea that the legal order depends only on the sovereign state is showing so many cracks. But this is at a public level, but also at a private level, there is a need to rediscover the importance of, how can I say, reconnecting the theory and practice of law to real people, to real lives. And so what happens is that the big challenge is to lift up this blindfold and understand that when justice can look into the eyes of real people, it's a good thing. Actually, it is not just missing impartiality, is rediscovering personality and interpersonality. And I must tell you that I was, to me, it was easy to be critical on the attitude of that was typically in the modern time, because I was formed within the school of the University of Padua, that in the last century has always reconnected law, not only to rules and to the dimension of regulation and dispute resolution, but in a very formal way. Our mentors, and I mean, it's really 5 generations of legal philosophers, used to say, the most important function of law is the conversion of conflict into controversy. So the possibility of giving instruments to the people to deal with conflict in a way that it's not just, you know, recreating an artificial idea of order. But of course, my mentors tended to think that the most important instrument for this was the trial, the legal process. So it was a process-centered perspective. And now that we have just finished writing a book on the 800 years of our university and rediscovering a little bit this last 120 years of legal philosophy at Padua, I was, in a sense, questioning a little bit this fact and saying, listen, the process is just one form by which you help the conversion of conflict into controversy. But it has some problems. And we all mediators know it, because you know when you choose a form that is adjudicative, of course you have a win-lose situation. The formality of the legal process creates a very fixed and very rigid object of the controversy that is not really adaptable to each situation. So you really need, at a certain point, somebody to decide and say, you are the winner, you lose. But this is not necessarily adaptive to each situation. And other arguments, like saying also that in the dialectics that happens in the legal process, the adversarial approach to dialogue maybe sometimes prevents the relational resources from reconnecting themselves when there is this possibility. And so what I started saying, and this is my personal perspective here, is the real meaning for law to be there is to habilitate people to dialogue when conflict happens, because conflict is, of course, unavoidable for philosophical reasons. And the reason is why we don't possess the truth. We are limited beings, structurally limited. And so each one of us carries something that is unique, but in a sense also open to conflicting to other views and other perspectives. So conflict is unavoidable. What is avoidable is violence. So the idea that when conflict happens, this has to explode in violent ways. Law is there to prevent this from happening, as the also old Greek and Roman tradition, in a sense, suggested. But the way law does it is not only the legal process. There are many different instruments. And probably what is really interesting in mediation is that it goes directly to the fact that conflict involves people and relationships. And so you don't just need to put a distance between them. You can work on reconnecting them exactly by putting them in the condition to connect. By what? By dialogue, by reasoning, by other forms of connection that involve also emotions, narratives, and other things. But this is exactly the terrain of the logos. That means not only reason and not only discourse, but is the kind of reason that connects people. So what I suggest is that we can find, also looking back at ancient philosophy in a sense, a way to reconnect the logos, so this idea of rationality, of relational rationality, and the nomos, the normativity. Why and how? Well, it is possible because, in a sense, law is already relational. Law is there to enable, to protect, to foster, to restore relationships, to restore a balance, in a sense. But sometimes you can do it without taking the sword of justice. You can just put away the sword and use the power of dialogue, which is not just, mere communication and whatever. It is really understanding that you can put the people in condition to analyze their situation and sometimes even create the norm of the case. So what I try to suggest is also that you don't need to depend on norms. In mediations, you create the norm of the case, as you do in a contract, actually. Of course, we all know the differences between contracts and mediations, but basically already in the legal theory, we know that you can create very contextual forms of order, and you can create norms for that case, for that situation, and the legislators can be the parties themselves. So to cut it short, and really it took me a little bit of time, but I would like to hear from you, Vikram, if you would like also to intervene and say something else. What I would like to suggest is that now, in a moment in which we are dealing with the failures of the modern dreams, and basically we don't even have a name for this age. We call it postmodern because it has so many relationships with the modernity, but it's not yet something new, totally new. So we are there. And some of the modern dreams, including the idea that we would create a pacified order by the state, by law, have become nightmares, in a sense, sometimes, and our world is no longer a very nice place to be in sometimes, also when you see through the eyes of legal frameworks. Maybe what we can do now, and the challenge of mediation is a part of this process, is to understand that the idea of creating an artificial order was not only a mistake, but really beyond the possibilities of human beings. But you could ask me, but don't you create a very situational order within mediations? Every mediation, isn't that a creation of a peculiar contextual order? In a sense, yes, but it is possible because people are already able to relate, are already able to communicate, are already able to recognize a certain idea of reciprocity. And so maybe the fact that human beings are structurally relational, structurally limited, provides them with the need to outline a way to deal with conflict in a way that is not violent, which is exactly, in my opinion, the reason why law is there. But if you think like this, you don't reduce law to regulation. You don't reduce dispute resolution to one way to deal with that. But law is there as protector, restorer, and grantor of a correct relationship between human beings. Final question, what is the correct relationship? You don't possess it. You need to search for it. And this is exactly why law is there, to put you in the condition, and sometimes also to foster the fact that you enter a dialogue with other people and search together. And so to put you in the condition of being limited, dialogical, but also there as a part of a search process, a never-ending research process that is enabled also by law. And mediation in this case is probably one of the most, how can I say, potentially strong processes that can enable and make people experience this dimension in a way that, to me, reconciles also the legal theory, legal practice, the professionals, and also their clients, the real world. Because sometimes I see people, and especially lawyers, that feel disappointed by the way people perceive justice and by the way people perceive their roles. But mediation provides them also with a chance to say, listen, I can help you, not only to solve your problem, but to restore your relationships in a way that is constructive and transformative. Of course, I need your collaboration. Okay, I would stop here.
Yeah, you should. Of course, it's always a pleasure listening to you. We don't want you to stop, but yes, sometimes there is a time limit. It should not be a time limit, but we can always have separate sessions. But of course, Mandy is here. Her session starts in the next maybe 9 minutes. Mandy, we're saying hi to you, although we know you're there, but you're not there. We don't know. So, but I was looking at Federico. Is that hi, Mandy?
Hi, Mandy.
Hi.
So Mandy, will you get you in also if you can want to ask Federico something, but we just based on what he was talking about, the blindfold, of course, the aspect of neutrality which comes in. I just want to put out that there is a symposium on neutrality and mediation, which starts on the 12th of December. Okay. And so this, of course, Mayor has written a lot about neutrality, which needs to be discussed because obviously it sometimes is used very casually, neutral and neutrality, but there is lots happening there which we need to discuss. So definitely that part. But tell me, Federico, when you look at the state and the functions of the state as people would look at, is there a conflict there that here you want to have what you want to put together is a people's process and the state's role as the state looks at it? The conflict there and how to handle that and how to take it forward, because when I see legislation, I see this conflict coming up, and this is where, according to me, mediation did not move in the right direction, because I don't think people have been able to understand the people's process, empowerment of the people, because that goes against the whole concept of the state. Maybe I don't know, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, you know, one thing is to enable people to do something. One thing is to do things as a superior power. And of course, you can see power as a sort of providing people with possibilities, so an enabling power, or power as a way to impose things. And of course, to me, when it's possible to enable people in their free and relational way to deal with things, and so to withdraw the other idea of power, then it is important to do so. The principle of subsidiarity, for instance, John Paul II, the Pope John Paul II had already written and promoted this at a religious level, but not only, of course, you don't need religion to do that. Of course, you can do it also philosophically, but the idea that you don't necessarily need the activation of a power when people can do things on their own. It's very important, of course, but it's not only that. You know, you said something about the blindfold and neutrality. In Italian, there is this kind of joke. We talk about equidistance, and somebody in the mediation world says equiproximity. So the mediator has to be equally close to people, and to do so you really need to look them into their eyes and feel them and be open to understanding them in a way that connects you with their humanity in a humble way. in a sense. And you're third, and you don't need to be above them or at a higher level. And to me, this is also a way to create to a lawyer some discipline, and to make yourself as a lawyer understand that you're not providing them with solutions that are already written, but that you're all searching for something. I sometimes use this metaphor of, we are in a journey together. Let me be traveling with you. I can be your guide for till the next curve, but then the direction is yours. But this doesn't mean, renouncing to your role. It is probably understanding that your role is to enable people, and this is empowering them rather than exercising power. And so it's not only about the blindfold, it's also about the sword. And maybe we can take the scale together. So to use these metaphors.
But Federico, where does colonization fit into this entire thing? We had a symposium on colonization, decolonization, and mediation, which I thought you should have been part of. But that mindset, because why I'm bringing in the state and that concept of state and the way it maybe continued, the concept coming from the colonization, that mindset, how that has moved, and are we moving away from that? Can we move away from that to be able to bring together a process where people can sit together and resolve something? So some connections there.
Briefly, I have a proverb that I like very much. It is, you don't throw the baby away with the wash water. So what I mean by that, I had a very interesting talk with my friend from India, who is a social anthropologist, and he explains to me that, for instance, I'm coming to your country now, that it's important to make people and tribes understand that they have their own customs, their own customary laws and whatever. And so the decolonizing process is very important, also not to be, in a sense, subjected to other mentalities that you don't feel your own. But he also told me, but there are tribes who were head cutters. So you don't have all, not all things that glitter can be gold. So to me, also in the time of cancel culture in the Western world, which is to me something really dangerous in a sense, it is important to understand what you want to save and what you want to change. So the decolonizing process, which is very important, shouldn't mean renouncing to anything you can learn from another culture, from our side of former colonizers or whatever, but also from the other side. So you can see the colonization process as something that has to end in terms of political exploitation and whatever, but you can turn it and transform it into a chance for making people come together and confront their own traditions and their own ideas. So you can have a transformative approach to that without, a refusal that could be really throwing the baby away with the wash water, which is also what we are doing in the Western world. We made only mistakes and let's go away from that. Rediscovering history is not, how can I say, defending history, but it's having a critical attitude of what is in our heritage and what we can learn from others. So, but you need to be balanced and you need to be humble in order to do so. And surely the decolonizing issue is very important, but it needs to be, in my opinion, it requires lots of intellectual honesty. Because it is wrong either to say, it's all my mistake, sorry, whatever, I have nothing to say to you. And the other mistake is, now let's go back to our traditions because are the only thing we have. We're in a globalized world, maybe humanity is all we have that puts us together, Of course, understanding that our differences are a richness, mutual enrichment. But in order to so, we need lots of mediators and good mediators, probably. Don't you think so?
Definitely. I think there's lots to discuss here, of course. And Mandy is not going to like us discussing anything more than that. So Mandy, we will conclude with Federico's concluding remarks. Federico, you want to conclude this because there is, in relation to indigenous peoples and mediation, there's been a symposium, mediation in our culture and traditions, there's been a symposium. So we've had a lot of conversations on this. So I won't get into all those things. But yes, like you said rightly, that everything that happened in indigenous communities wasn't the best. There were all kinds of practices to say that, oh, this was all very good and mediation was happening or people were resolving their disputes amicably. Definitely it's not going to be something we can make a blanket statement of, definitely. So Federico, but tell me something.
Remark. Sorry.
I'm just thinking that, do I pronounce it correctly? Is it Federico or is it Federico?
Federico. The problem is the surname, because every language has a different pronunciation, but the correct one is Reggio, is also the name of the city. So
okay. No, I was trying to figure out, because when we say ciao, we use the C as a ch. And in this case, with your C there, we don't use it at a ch. We still
because there is no E. There is no E and no I. So ciao, but if you don't have the I or the E, it's cow. So
perfect. Federico is okay. Good.
The difference. Anyway, the only thing I would like to say to conclude and to leave the floor to Mandy and don't steal time is it was really a quick, reconstruction of a historical process. But my concluding remarks are like this. You don't understand where you are if you don't understand where you come from. I'm really afraid that we in the Western world are really missing the chance to study our path behind. And this is missing the chance to understand where we are going. And the idea typical of the modern human beings that we create things by doing them is quite a dangerous thing, because many dreams can turn into nightmares. And so to me, my concluding remark is, of course, mediation is future oriented, it's a challenging thing, but to understand the potentials and pitfalls of everything, including mediations, you also need to look back at what you leave behind and understand where you are and where you come from, especially in the Western world, where we really, when I think we are really throwing away the baby with the bathwater. So let me conclude with this remark.
Perfect, Federico. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure listening to you. And we have a closing session today with, of course, Ken Cloke's closing address. Please join us. Yep. So thank you very much.